I was a student, a grad student at UBC, and one of the courses I was taking in my first year of grad school, I'd studied quite a bit of anthropology and sociology prior to that at both UBC and Sir George Williams, as it then was in Montreal, and at York University, and way back in UBC when I first went to school. And I was a mature student by this time, and I was in the anthropology sociology department, and I was signed up for a course called analysis of myth. And I'd taken a course on that the year before from Ellie Miranda, who was a very formal, she was very structural analysis of myth, and a friend of mine that I was working with on a project that summer said, "Oh, you'll like Robin. He's a trip." So, okay, he was going to be in the class as well. So I walked over to the small classroom, actually sort of a shack where this class was going to be, and there I was. There was only about 5 of us in the class, and we sat there and waited about 10 minutes, and then the door opened, and this very, very high hippie guy wearing dirty suede pants and a homespun shirt with hair out to here walked in. And he sat down, and he didn't say anything for a few minutes. And then he said, "Hi, I'm Robin Ridington." So I thought, this guy is a trip, that's for sure. And the trip's gone on for 40 years. That was in 1973, actually. And so after the class was over, we became a couple. And we were very careful that I wasn't a student at the time. And besides which, I was a mature student. I wasn't an 18-year-old kid, so that was okay. And we got married in 1976, and, I was hearing all about the Dane-Zaa people for years, and they came and visited us in our house, and I got to know some of them. And finally, in 1978, I did my first trip with Robin and a friend of ours, Howard Broomfield, who was our sound man, and who we met at Co-op Radio and done a bunch of radio programs with him, and which we continued to do until his death in 1986. And for CBC and all kinds of other outlets. And so I went up, and we were spending a month there. We had Robin's 2 older kids, Eric and Amber, with us, who were then 9 and 11, I guess. And they had a tent. Howard had a tent, and we had a tent. And it was Monias Tent City. And at that time, Doig was just a road with plywood shacks on one side and a dirty old band hall at the end, and outhouses out the back, toilets on the front lawns because they had cracked when people were away hunting in the winter, and so they were useless, so they threw them out and went back to the outhouses. And very small plywood shacks that were heated by one of those old tin stoves, wood stoves that heated a part of it, but not much of anything, and a bunch of people in these very small spaces, and it was not good. But I got to know mostly the women, particularly one woman, Dana, who became a close friend and who taught me a lot about snaring rabbits and bush skills, women's bush skills, finding berries and all that, and told me a lot of stories. And she was about to become a grandmother, and so was I. My oldest daughter was having a baby that summer, or in the fall, and she just had her first grandchild. And I wrote about that. I wrote about her meeting her in a paper that's been published in several places. And we spent a month there, and it was amazing and wonderful and awful in some ways. But, one of the focusing experiences of my life, I guess. And after that, we went back every summer for pretty much ever since. I haven't gone the last couple of summers because I've had a couple of knee operations and haven't been able to. But other than that, we've continued to go up every year and, watch the kids grow up and get married and have kids of their own and watch TV come in. And I remember the day the phone lines went in. And our phone was just buzzing off the hook all day because they thought, who can we phone? Oh, we'll phone Robin and Jilian. So, they had never had phones before. Now they've all got cell phones, and every truck has a cell phone in it, and everybody's dash, But at that time, they were poor. They were very poor back in '78. And they had just gotten a housing program together. And a few new houses started to be built, I guess, the next year, and much larger, more accommodation for families. And gradually, all those plywood shacks got replaced. And the people were starting to get more in tune with modernity. TV came in, and that was when the kids started losing the language, because the kids would watch TV and pick up English, and the parents would pick it up, and they'd stop talking to the kids in Dane-Zaa. And so really the last generation that are completely first language Dane-Zaa was the kids that I knew in 1978 and 79, around that time. I think TV came in the early 80s, so that was when it changed. And everybody now who's under 40 basically is unilingual English. They understand maybe some Dane-Zaa words, but they don't really, they don't converse in it. They don't speak to their children in it. And Billy Achachi, who we've worked very closely with for many, many years, he's our translator and the linguist. He's a very important figure in doing the book we did, Where Happiness Dwells. He did a lot of the translation of the stories for that. And he's been trying to get the language reestablished. And it's hard. It's hard because you can't if you don't have the kids speaking it, it goes. It really goes. And but they are still, as Robin said, they're still dancing. They aren't doing things like first menstruation ceremonies anymore that I know of. The last women to do that would now be in their 40s. Perhaps it's still going and we just haven't known about it, But there's good and bad. They receive, as you probably know if you've read the book, they received a large settlement in the 90s, and that's changed their ways of life a lot. There's been oil and gas development, which has been just incredible, that has ruined their land and, really stopped the moose hunting to a large extent. It's much harder now, and when, the boys still go out and get a first moose, and girls now do it too, more so than they used to do. There isn't the taboo it used to be that a woman who was of menstruating age could not hunt. But old woman, she just like a man. She could go hunt. So I was allowed to hunt because I was already in my 40s by that time. They didn't ask me whether or not I was still menstruating. And so I was allowed to go on hunts, but I never actually hunted. Robin had done that, but I never did. Don't like guns. And they still do that, but now often a boy will get his first moose and it'll be riddled with disease. They go to the salt licks from the oil wells, and there's the sulfur is mixed in with them, and it's not good. So they still do it, but the rewards aren't the same. The women are still teaching how to make dry meat, how to do hides. That generation of women that I know as young girls who are now in their 40s and 50s are still teaching those skills to the younger women, and that's great. And I hope that continues. And, you know, the major things that, other than just doing the observation field work that we've done all these years, and one of the things that I learned the first time we went up there, one of the things Robin said before I left, and certainly Howard emphasized it because he was so into sound, he said, open your ears and listen, you know. And that's a technique that we've always used in our field work, is we don't ask questions. We don't, not very often, they don't like being asked direct questions. You sit and you listen, you observe, you may take notes, but we taped a lot. We have thousands and thousands of hours of tape. And we started with these reel-to-reel, you know, the old Ewer recordings that you have to stop every 15 minutes. You say, sorry, I have to flip my tape, and you have to change the reel. And we went from those to cassettes and then to digital. And now everything's pretty much has been digitized. We took thousands of slides, and now those have been digitized. Most of them, we still have some to go. We'd like to get those done while we still can. And so it's been wonderful. It's been an amazing 40 years. In the, when was it? It would be just about 2000, wasn't it, when they asked me to do a genealogy, and based on what Robin had done in his thesis, which they didn't even know about, but that's what we used. And they wanted to do this for land claims research and that kind of thing. And so we, you know, they thought it would be something that we could do in a couple of months. And it ended up, Robin joined me on the project, and then we had two people who were working at Blueberry. We were commissioned by Doig. And Pat Cleary and Mitchell Goodchon joined the team, and we spent one entire summer, as well as much time between summers. We spent one entire summer on Retreat Island with them in residence in our guest house, working every day, going through all these records. Mitch was very good in French, and he could understand, I think, because he'd had Jesuit training, the old scroll of the missionary priests and so on. So we used those records from the Catholic Church records. We used the Department of Indian Affairs records. We used Robin's genealogy from his thesis, which proved to be remarkably accurate as to, you know, the stories that the old people of 1960s had told him about who their ancestors were. And we constructed what turned out to be an amazing genealogy. And that's on file at all the band offices, and they're using it in treaty land entitlement cases. And we found about 50 people who had not been recorded in the 1914 census, which was the basis of their original allotment of land. And so there's 125 acres for every person was supposed to be allotted. So there's a huge amount of land that's at stake in all those claims, and those are still ongoing. They've recognized, the courts have recognized our genealogy as being true and basic, and have allowed it in the court cases. So that's a wonderful achievement. And then they asked us to write a book on their history, and that took us another 5 years. So, and that was published in 2013, and it did very well. I hope a lot of them have read it. Certainly the Doig band purchased one for every member, and the school board purchased 60-something copies to distribute in the classrooms. And so it's up there, and the knowledge is out there, because the main thing they were concerned about is that the kids don't know all this history. And we started, you know, with the first explorers coming and the fur trade coming in, and all the stories that the people told. And it was the story that has been told many, many times from the perspective of the white explorers, and we had information from all the Hudson's Bay Company factors and all those kinds of things, and some historical books and so on. But the main thing we used was the stories of the old people, and most of it is stories, and a lot from Charlie Yahe, but a lot from Billy, May Absasson, and her father, Charlie Dominic, and many of the elders now. And so they gave us all these stories, and we incorporated it into what we could find from the historical documents, and it turned out to be a 400-page book. A lot of stories and a lot of information. Is probably more than they expected they were going to get, but that's what they got. So, and that came out in 2013, and it's sort of the culmination of all our work for 40 years and Robin's for 50 odd. It's there, and that's much our legacy as anything, I guess. Do you want to come and be part of it now? I don't know what else I want to say.
After I'd been working with Charlie Yahe in the late 1960s for quite a while, and I'd heard a lot of Dane-Zaa stories, one of the stories that I'd heard bits and pieces of was the Dane-Zaa creation story. It's about how a muskrat dove down under the water, got a little bit of dirt under his fingernails, his or her fingernails, and brought it back, and the creator put it on a cross at the center of the water, and it grew. He told it to grow, and it became the world. It's a long story, but that's sort of the essence of it. So I wanted to hear Charlie Yahe's version of this story. In fact, I asked him once to tell it, and he told it, but I didn't record that one. And then I thought, I really would like to record this one. So I said, would you be willing to do that? And normally I would just record things as they were happening, but this time I actually made a request for, I called it the papal audience. And so I made the request, and he said, yes, probably. I'll let you know. So one day he sent somebody over and said, I'm ready to go. And he began the story with a little joke. He said, I guess you've heard that story before, but you want to hear it again to see which one is best. And then he said, I'm talking to this white man on the tape recorder, but the world will listen to my voice. And he was a dreamer, a prophet, and this was his way of saying, I hope you don't lose the tapes, and I hope that future generations of Dane-Zaa people will listen to my voice. And indeed, I think he meant also people outside the Dane-Zaa community. The world, he said, the world will listen to my voice. And I recently put together a video of him telling the creation story with a scrolling text of the translation from Billy Attache and the video part of scenes around the Dane-Zaa environment. And this summer, I showed it. It was the world premiere of this video. I showed it at the Doig Cultural Days, out in an outdoor setting. We just put a tarp out as it got dark, a white tarp, and showed it from a projector. And quite an audience was lined up, and they were stunned. Most of them had not known Charlie Yahe. He died in 1976. So they were really stunned. A lot of them were the younger generation who didn't even know Beaver very well. So and they all came up to me afterward, and he said, he's still talking to us. He's still here talking to us. Our dreamer is still with us. And so that's what he said, the world will listen to my voice. And I think, in a way, that was an inspiration for the theme of the book.
Yes.
It was the Dane-Zaa will tell the world through their stories, their history.
And that was sort of you did all those recordings in the 60s, but you hadn't done that much with them until we met Howard. You'd given tapes to the people, but then we met Howard Broomfield in the probably around 1977, when we were both working at Co-op Radio, volunteering, and Howard was there. We did a program together, and he ended up actually living in our basement for many years. And he came with us on that first trip in 1978, and first thing he did was go out and take a 24-hour soundscape of everything. He'd worked on the Soundscape Project, the World Soundscape Project with R. Murray Schafer. And so he wanted to tape everything. He said, tape everything. Robin had not had very many tapes when he was doing his earlier feed work. So he was very careful about how he used them, and didn't tape everything. Now we had I guess we had a grant from
the National Museum of
Man, as it was at that
National
time.
Museum of Man, it was called
Back then.
Then it was the Museum of Civilization. I think Harper changed it to something absurd, but we won't talk about
anyway,
that.
We had a grant, so we had lots of reel-to-reel tape then, and we got additional grants for cassettes and whatnot. And in the early 80s, about 1980, we started making radio programs for not only CFRO Co-op Radio, but also CBC, Our Native Land. Howard and I did one for Hornby Collection about an sulfur explosion at Blueberry that forced the band to move. That was called... what was it called?
Suffering Me Slowly.
Suffering Me Slowly, yeah. And that was played on CBC a few times. And so we started getting the world to listen to their voices. And Robin has done more video than I have. He's converted to video after Howard died, I guess.
Yeah, well, we continued. Then we went on to mini disc recordings, which
Right.
meant that you had a virtually unlimited amount of recording capacity.
Yeah, so we
the
recorded
batteries
everything.
were not an issue anymore. My initial work was I hooked up a 6-volt fence battery to the ewer, because otherwise you had to use huge numbers of flashlight batteries. So, but batteries were always an issue, and now they weren't. I could record everything. And we went on long drives through the territory with elders, telling stories about places as we passed and as we stopped and visited.
Yeah.
And all of that was recorded. I recorded continually unless people said, turn it off.
Yeah. And Howard got them used to that. He always had his earphones on and the mic in front of him, and they knew he recorded everything. And because he did that and they got accustomed to it, it was fine for us to just walk around with her, and it was much easier by the time we got to cassettes and mini discs to walk around with those than it had been when you were looking at and all the tapes that you needed to keep changing.
And the people really appreciated that. And a few years ago, we got funding from Doig and Blueberry, the two different bands, the successor bands to the original Fort St. John band. And they paid to digitize the entire collection. So it's all now available in digital form, and it's pretty well logged. So you can actually search for names, dates, places, keywords, and find them. They come up.
Hear your grandmother, she was alive when we were taping. She's in there somewhere, probably.
It's all there now. It now fits on a portable hard drive.
All of it. It's amazing.
And then for about the last 10 or 12 years, I've switched to video because you still got the audio. It's just as good audio. It's good digital audio. But the video equipment now is so portable, so easy to use. Batteries are not an issue. Tapes are not content. The amount you can record is not the issue, and content is fantastically important. I've always felt that any kind of recording, content is the most important thing, even if it's not ideal recording conditions. Sometimes, well, some of the most amazing recordings that I've done were driving in a vehicle where with the video, I'm holding the video camera and they're bouncing up and down. There's an elder telling stories. The audio is terrible, but it's intelligible. And this particular one is not really usable for making any kind of a video document. But the content is fantastic. And this one story, for instance, ended up in our book. It's an important story. And quite often, the elders would like to tell stories when they're driving around in the van, the Doig van, with a bunch of other elders. And they just get to talking to one another and telling stories. It's the occasion when they're a group of them together.
Remember when we camped here? Oh, yeah, I remember. I saw my grandfather.
And the stories are all in Beaver. So like this particular one was, I know enough Beaver to know immediately what she was talking about and how this was a really important story. So I went on air immediately. That's what we say. Went on air. Just
We've even got one from a helicopter, don't we?
Yeah, we've got some helicopter shots.
What the whirly-bird noises.
And that story, plus then many other stories that we recorded working with elders more recently for the book, because they got into the project and they realized that there's a lot of stories that I hadn't recorded in audio, and so we recorded those in video, and those are all nicely recorded, excellent quality video, excellent quality audio, well mic'd, well everything. Reasonably. Occasionally, you get weird backlighting situations because of where somebody wanted to sit or whatever. But usually they were pretty good recordings. And our collaborator Billy Attachi at Doig translated all of these for us because they're all in Beaver. And a lot of them, well, all of the translations, I've time coded the translations. So anybody who wants, including me, I've done this a number of times, can go back to the original text, the original video, have the time code, identify exactly where we are in the story and in relation to the translation. And if you know enough Beaver, you can then place exactly where a text should be on a video document that you want to use. Another one we did was Charlie Yahe's daughter, his last remaining
Margaret Davis.
Margaret Yahe Davis, and her daughter said, we'd really like you to record our mom because she's got great stories. So we did. We set it up and recorded her. And one of the amazing things about this recording was she had my photograph of her dad on the wall. So as I was doing the video of her, I was able to pan up once in a while to go from her talking about her dad to the picture of him that was in her home.
And that was so opportune because she died a year or two after. Yeah. And she was the last of Charlie Yahe's children. And but now there's his grandsons are being very helpful. So.
Dane-Zaa oral history is so amazing, in part because they never were subjected to residential schools. Unlike most First Nations who were savaged by that experience, were traumatized by it, and lost a lot of their culture. For some reason, they were not sent to residential schools. More cynical opinion that some people have said is, well, they didn't want us to get educated because then we'd figure out how badly we'd been treated. I don't know. I think it was
more logical explanation is that they were off in the bush or something when they came around to try and find
benign neglect, because they were, when I first met them, they were still quote unquote bush Indians. They were living, spending all summer camped out in the bush. Then the men would go off trapping most of the winter, and the reserve a lot of the time would be unpopulated or just a few people there. There was a school, so the kids would have to go to the school. But the oral history we've found is just fantastic. For instance, one of the stories that I've heard from a number of different people is about a man, an ancestor, who we can trace genealogically as a a known ancestor of people alive today, named Dukhi-Sachin. That's his sort of dreamer's name. And Dukhi-Sachin means he slept with giant animals. It means that his vision quest experience was one of the giant animals from mythic times. And there's a whole set of stories about that, about how the culture hero Saya overcame them. So it's a very powerful name. He was a very powerful man, and he was probably an early dreamer. And his father was also named Dukhi-Sachin. And one of the stories that goes back farthest is a story about Dukhi-Sachin the Elder. And that story is set entirely in pre-contact times. There's no question about it. There's no reference to white people, no reference to fur trade, no reference to firearms. Dukhi-Sachin the Elder probably lived from 1730-something to, or 20-something to 1780 or so. His son, Dukhi-Sachin the Younger, was probably born somewhere around the 1770s or 80s, maybe something like that. So he spanned the fur trade, the advent of the fur trade era. And the story of Dukhi-Sachin the Elder, one of the interesting things about it is that it describes him being in a place where there's a long straight river surrounded by mountains. Well, that's not the Peace River. The Peace River is surrounded by prairie country. It almost certainly, well, it has to be Rocky Mountain Trench. It's not the Parsnip River, which is the southern tributary, so it's the Finley River, Rocky Mountain Trench, which is to the west of the most easterly range of the Rocky Mountains. And I recorded another story just last summer from Charlie Ahe's grandson, a long, long story, another story, a same story, but his version of Dukhi-Sachin, that actually names the place where Dukhi-Sachin the Younger came from, which was, he said, Fort Graham, which is Rocky Mountain Trench, Finley River. So it's pretty much a slam dunk that that's where Dukhi-Sachin the Elder lived and where Dukhi-Sachin the Younger grew up. And then in Randy's story, it talks about Dukhi-Sachin the Younger being such a powerful man, he had such a reputation that the people, the Tsipitane people, the Muskeg people, who later became the Dog River First Nation, were having troubles with, because there was a lot of inter-band fighting at the time. They were having troubles and they wanted a really strong person to come and help them out. So they sent an envoy across the mountains to the Rocky Mountain Trench area to visit Dukhi-Sachin. And they said, we need your help. You're a real powerful guy. And we've got you set up with a really nice woman you're going to like. And he said, okay. So he came, joined the Tsipit-Dene, married into the Tsipit-Dene, and as a result, two of his children were listed on the 1899 Northwest Mounted Police Census, named, and they are well-known ancestors of the people at Doig today. So that oral history goes back well before contact times. And that's pretty remarkable to have a story that you can trace genealogically, you can follow the family line all the way back, I mean, think about my family. I can't do that. Certainly not from oral history. I have a family Bible that goes back to the 1770s with some names in it. No stories, though. I don't know much about them.
One of the other stories we got was the perspective of the First Nations people on what was called the Fort St. John Massacre, which occurred,
1823.
That's what I thought. And, which had been written up in the traders' journals and so on. And it was, of course, all from their perspective about how these marauding Indians came and butchered the factor and so on. What had happened is that one of the sons of one of the Dane-Zaa had eaten a meal with the factor and had died from whatever he ate, or so that was what they presumed. And the factory refused to compensate in any way. And so the father said, well, that we can't have this. This is, you have to compensate me. You have to give my son's body. We have to have a proper burial. And so there was, that background to what happened. And as a result of that, of course, the Hudson's Bay closed the port. And but they had to go away into Alberta to trade for many years after that. But to hear the perspective of the First Nations people rather than just the accounts in the traders' journals and so on was really impressive. And that's what we were able to do in the book, is take the history that has been written up to now and insert into that or overlay on that the perspectives of the people.
I wrote a paper recently, it's in BC Studies, Journal BC Studies, called Dane-Zaa Oral History, Why It's Not Hearsay.
Yeah.
Because there's a big controversy in the legal and academic communities, especially legal communities, that for years oral history was just written off as hearsay. And it's beginning to become accepted more in Canadian courts. Beverly McLaughlin, Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin, made a recent decision that gave a little more possibility of taking it seriously. But I wrote this just to show how incredibly accurate the Dane-Zaa oral history actually is. Just one little funny, back to Charlie Yahe. When I first met Charlie Yahe, his wife, Bella Anatchouin, who was older than he was, she seemed like, older than God. She really seemed
well, apparently she was listed as the oldest person in Canada when she died. The CBC announced that the oldest person in Canada had died, and she was 116. And so that was in the early
75, I think.
Something like just before Charlie Yahe. So she had been around a long, long time.
But anyway, when I first met Charlie Yahe, she said, "Don't talk to this man. He's a spy for the government. He wants to find out who killed the Hudson Bay man, and they're gonna come and kill us all."
And then Robin had to look. They asked him to drive her around while they were going to something in Fort St. John. Remember that story?
Yeah, well, before that, Jumbie, this is the time I'd come down with Jumbie and Sam St. Pierre and those people in January. And Jumbie knew me really well by then. And he said, "Yeah, cool, it's okay. He's a friend, he's not a spy." So that was all right with her. But the interesting thing is that story to her was still contemporary history. That story was active, and she probably knew people who were there.
She wouldn't have been alive then, but her father was chief attaché. She signed the treaty. He signed the treaty in 1900. So, she would have known people and would have heard from him probably about the massacre.
Some of the elders that she knew when she was growing up would probably have experienced those events directly.
And she would have been alive in 1900.
But the story about driving into town, they left her in my van, my Chevy 4x4 panel truck, and I was assigned the job of babysitting her. While everybody else went around shopping and stuff, and she just kept telling me to go here and go there and pointing. And I could tell what she was looking for was the trails that she was familiar with. They used to camp there. It wasn't a town. There was zero town there. It was a camping spot. It was a traditional camping spot for the people, Gatacon. And she was just wanting to find something familiar, wanting to find the trails, and she didn't. It was all paved over. And they finally came back and relieved me of my duties. But we should talk about the genealogical project a little bit more. I know you gave the basic outlines of it.
Yeah.
But when my first field work, one of the obvious things that an anthropologist should do in a community like the Dane-Zaa is in addition to the TAT project, which I gave up on quickly, was genealogies. I wanted to see how everybody is related because I had a strong interest in kinship and in hunter-gatherer studies. And so it was obvious to find out not only how everybody was related, but how they knew who they were related to and how much knowledge they had, how far back the information went.
And the terms that they used.
The terms that they used. So I was able to construct on paper, laboriously, really elaborate genealogies going back a number of generations with all the Dane-Zaa names of the people that the elders had told me about, and many of which had never been recorded, to my knowledge, anywhere else. And then when we did the treaty land entitlement research, and Mitch Goodjohn was looking through the oblate records and finding all of this information written in a 19th century French script, which was hard for us to interpret, but he could figure it out. We found all these names that had been recorded, because when the priest baptized a child, they always gave the child a saint's name, which was useless to us. Yeah. But they recorded the real names, the Dane-Zaa names, of the parents and estimated their ages. So we found a number of the people that had been recorded way back on these genealogies, recorded by the priests in the 1780s or so, 1880s, and the ages of the parents. So we were able to
the father.
The father, yeah, that's
they
right.
They would never give the mother's name, not very often.
Occasionally
we found one in a marriage certificate, but often they just called her wife.
What we found a number of on the baptismal records, a number of they give the father's name, Beaver name, and then they'd ask, "What is your wife's name?" And the man would say Satsege, so they'd write down Sege. So we found Mitch, who found this out initially, said, "Wow, that lady Sege sure got around. She's married to so many people." And of course, I knew what it meant. It means wife in Beaver. So they just said, "Wife, that's my little wifey." But it really helped. It really helped us to establish the credibility of our research, that there was all this correspondence between the oral history that I'd collected in the 1960s with information that had been recorded by the priests almost 100 years
and
previously.
And the DIA. The DIA, there was the problem that they did the households by the head of household, which of course was almost always the male, unless it was a widow. And then they just number of women, number of boys, number of girls, no names. So it was, it was like doing a massive jigsaw puzzle to put the pieces from those records together with the priest records, the marriage certificates, and all that, and together with Robin's information. I mean, it was no wonder it took us years to get it together.
And as Jilian said, the researchers for Canada accepted our information entirely. Yeah. There's no question about it. It was a slam dunk as far as they were concerned. So the bands are currently in the process of negotiating a settlement for 128 acres per person that was missed, plus 100 years of lack of use, which is some of which they're hoping to get some land, and some of which they'll get cash. And we're not involved in that. That's between them and the government.
It started in 1945 when the veterans were coming back from World War II, and a lot of them wanted to farm, and there's beautiful farmland in the Peace River Valley, or will be until the Site C grab goes in. And So the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Department of Indian Affairs decided that the land in the Peace River Valley was too good for the Indians who weren't using it for farming. And what they were using it for was that there was basically their summer gathering place. This was primarily the beautiful, beautiful piece of land right near Fort St. John that they'd been allotted in 1916 as IR 172. It was called the Montney Reserve. And so nobody at that time spoke English. Nobody could read and write. And by whatever means, they ended up signing away that the chief signed, and what they understood at the time was not very much. And they were then allotted several years later, after the deal was taking place in 1945. They were allotted smaller reserves way further out, and they found out. All the elders were saying, "What happened to our land? Where did it go?" They were forbidden from going back there, and it had been their summer gathering place, the place where people came together in the summer to sing and dance and introduce new babies, to get together, people got married, and it had been very important to them, but not seen in that way by the white officials who
We
took
should
it
talk
away.
about the name.
It's good.
The Beaver name was Tsu-ne-chike-chike, which means the place where happiness dwells.
Which is where we got the
And
title
that's
for the book.
the name of our book was Where Happiness Dwells. And that was Jerry Attache, who was the chief at the time who was responsible for bringing this whole court case that happened. He suggested that title.
And he was the one that in 1972, he had been to school for a few years. There was a day school on the reserve, and that started in the early 50s. And so today's elders went there when they were in their, adolescent ages, and got a few years of schooling. And Jerry was one of those then. And he got enough reading and writing so that he could communicate with white people very well. And he kept hearing the elders talk about, where did our land go? What happened to our beautiful reserve? So he went and dug up all these documents and went to see lawyers and found the old Indian agent from that time who said there's been something going wrong here. And they eventually launched a court case, which took many, many years to come to court. But what eventually came to light was that the mineral rights for that land, and it turned out to be floating on oil, so all those former military people who had come back and had that land were getting these huge royalty checks, and the bands were starving out of these bad reserves. And so Jerry took it to court. It took years and years for them to get the case together, and finally in 1997, I think was the decision came down.
It ended up in the Supreme Court.
It went to through all the courts. One decision went one way, another went the other. They ended up in the Supreme Court, and they got $164 million, not for the old reserve, but for the mineral rights that had not been transferred as normally is done when the sale went through. So that has changed their lives dramatically. They've got money, and but it was an enormous task for them to get through it. The fact that they had so little resources and so little book knowledge and managed to do this is amazing.
All the elders came and gave testimony in court, and also did video testimony and examinations for discovery, and it was just an important event. And the reserve itself was the old land was never understood by the white people as not just a place that was their summer gathering place, but it was like a food bank, because it was a very rich place for lots and lots of game, and there was enough game that could support people for 3 or 4 weeks, a large number of people, hundreds of people for that length of time. And of course, hunting people, as I talked about in my thesis, are very much dependent upon the limitations and opportunities of the ecology. And normally, you can't have hundreds of people living together for any length of time hunting moose in that area. But this one favored area was good enough, was rich enough that if you don't hunt it throughout the year, but save it for that one time, you could bring together these hundreds of people. And it was a really important time for cultural communication. All the different bands, not just the ones from Doig and Blueberry, but the ones closer to the Rocky Mountains, came together. And the dreamers told stories, and people sang and danced together. Marriages were contracted, young people got together. It was just a fantastically important time, and it was not just culturally important, but it was ecologically important. It was a really important part of their seasonal rounds, and that hasn't been understood. And I think ultimately that is going to be explained to a court in some other context. It looks as if they're beginning to want to take some action on that issue.
In the initial case in the BC courts, Judge Addy was a very old-fashioned judge who was probably somewhat of a racist. He's dead now, so I can say that. And he refused to listen to the elders' testimony. He said it's all hearsay. None of it's, And John Davis, who was then the eldest elder, he's since passed on, said, all I can tell you is what I know, and he told what he knew. He was there when the agreement was signed to surrender. And they didn't believe him. They didn't believe his testimony because it was not verifiable, they said, and no, there wasn't a written document that proved what he said was true. And it was so terribly embarrassingly disregarding the knowledge that that beautiful old man had, and all those elders had. It was just.
Yeah, the judge privileged a document with some X's on it, which was notarized by the local fur trader, who was also a notary public, and an RCMP officer, and that document trumped everything that the elders said that they had experienced. It was. I don't think that kind of judgment would come down now. Hopefully, I think the courts have evolved.
And finally, by the time it got to the Supreme Court, the judgment was changed. But they didn't get their land back. They didn't get the value of their land back. They got the mineral rights only.
And they didn't get an apology. They didn't get a recognition that the primary judgment had been wrong. It was a technicality about the mineral rights, which, that's fine. They got a bunch of money out of it, but they still felt that they had been disrespected. It was one of those honor of the crown issues.
And they had been disrespected.
Yeah.
Egregiously so.
It's still, I think it's a really important case that's anybody who's taking a law school course dealing with First Nations legal issues will study that case carefully.
Yeah, John Berger wrote about it in his
book.
He
wrote a book.
Thomas Berger.
Thomas Berger, yeah.
John Berger's another writer. And he has a whole chapter on it.
Well, he was he was a lawyer for when it went to the Supreme Court. He took the case to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.